Imagine being lost in the desert, alone, no water, no hope, until a wild animal becomes your only chance of survival. This is the story of Emily, a 4-year-old girl abandoned by her stepfather, saved by an unexpected ally, a bobcat. What happens when a child and a wild animal fight to survive together? Stay until the end, subscribe, turn on notifications, and comment where you're watching from. Let's get started. The late afternoon sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the empty highway that stretched endlessly through the Arizona desert. Heat waves rippled above the cracked asphalt, distorting the horizon like a cruel mirage. A battered, dust-covered pickup truck sped down the road, its tires kicking up a thick cloud of dirt. Inside, a man gripped the wheel tightly, his jaw clenched in frustration. Beside him, in the passenger seat, sat a little girl no older than 4. Emily. She was small for her age, with delicate features framed by dark, tangled curls. Her bright blue eyes, wide and curious, flickered between the passing landscape and the silent man beside her. She didn't understand why they had been driving for so long. Her stomach rumbled, and her lips were dry, but she had learned not to complain. Complaining made him mad. The man, Roy Tanner, was not her father. He had never wanted her, not really. Emily had been nothing but a burden ever since her mother, Lisa, had died 6 months ago. At first, he had tried to keep up the charade, pretending to care, but Emily was different. Strange. Quiet. She rarely spoke, and when she did, it was often in whispers. She hated being touched, flinched at loud noises, and became lost in her own world when things overwhelmed her. Roy didn't understand her, and more importantly, he didn't want to. Now, he had made up his mind. "You're better off here," he muttered under his breath, barely glancing at the child beside him. His grip on the steering wheel tightened as he pressed his foot harder on the gas. Emily shifted in her seat. "Where are we going?" she asked softly. Roy didn't answer. The road ahead was empty, flanked by nothing but dry, cracked earth and scattered cacti. No houses, no gas stations, no signs of life for miles. That was exactly what he wanted. After a few more minutes, he pulled over abruptly, causing the tires to crunch against the gravel. Emily sat up straighter, looking around. There was nothing but desert, stretching as far as her little eyes could see. The sudden stop made her uneasy. Roy exhaled sharply and turned to her for the first time in hours. His brown eyes were cold, void of any warmth. "Get out," he ordered, his voice clipped and emotionless. Emily blinked. "What?" "Get out of the truck, Emily," he repeated, slower this time, as if speaking to someone too stupid to understand. She hesitated, gripping the seatbelt that was still fastened across her small body. "But, where are we?" Roy's patience snapped. "Now, damn it," he barked, reaching over and yanking the seatbelt free. Emily flinched, her body instinctively curling inward as she slid toward the door. Her heart pounded in her chest, though she didn't fully understand what was happening. Trembling, she climbed out of the truck, her small sneakers sinking slightly into the hot dirt. The wind was dry and rough against her skin, carrying the scent of dust and heat. She turned back toward the vehicle, expecting Roy to follow. Instead, he slammed the door shut. "Roy." Her voice wavered, barely above a whisper. He didn't look at her. His hands gripped the steering wheel again, knuckles white. For a brief moment, there was hesitation in his eyes, a flicker of doubt. But then he shook it off. Emily took a step toward the truck. "Wait." The engine roared back to life, and before she could react, the tires spun against the gravel, kicking up a cloud of dust that stung her eyes. "Roy," she cried out, stumbling forward. The truck sped off, leaving her standing alone in the middle of nowhere. She ran after it. Her little legs pumped as hard as they could, but the vehicle only grew smaller and smaller until it disappeared over the horizon, swallowed by the unforgiving desert. Silence. The sudden stillness was deafening. Emily stood frozen, her tiny chest heaving, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. Her eyes, wide with confusion, scanned the endless stretch of barren land around her. There was no one. No houses. No cars. No voices calling her name. Just the desert. And the realization settled in her small, fragile mind. He wasn't coming back. A whimper escaped her lips, and she turned in slow circles, searching for something. Anything that could help her understand what had just happened. She was alone. The air felt thicker, heavier. The last traces of the truck's dust cloud faded into the sky, leaving her completely abandoned in the harsh Arizona wilderness. Emily swallowed hard, her throat dry and scratchy. She wanted to cry, but something inside her told her to stay quiet. She had learned to be quiet when she was scared. Crying never helped. So instead, she did what her mother used to tell her whenever she felt lost or overwhelmed. She started walking. Her sneakers kicked up small puffs of dirt as she moved forward, though she had no idea where she was going. She just knew she couldn't stay in one place. The sun was sinking lower, painting the sky in soft shades of orange and pink. The heat still pressed down on her, but the shadows were growing longer. Night would come soon, and with it, dangers she couldn't yet comprehend. Emily didn't know how far she had walked when she heard the first sound of life, the faint rustling of something moving nearby. She stopped. Her breath hitched as she slowly turned her head toward the noise. Not far from where she stood, beneath the shade of a lone, twisted tree, a pair of golden eyes watched her. A lynx. The animal was lean, its reddish fur slightly matted, and one of its front legs appeared to be injured. But despite its weakened state, it remained still, unblinking, staring directly at her. Emily stared back. She should have been afraid. But instead, for the first time since being left behind, she felt something else entirely. She wasn't alone anymore. The desert was vast, stretching endlessly in every direction. The sky, once streaked with the soft pastels of the setting sun, had deepened into an inky blue, speckled with the first twinkling stars of the night. The temperature had already begun to drop, the oppressive heat of the day giving way to an eerie, bone-chilling cold. Emily stood still, her small frame barely distinguishable against the backdrop of dry, cracked earth and sparse vegetation. Her breathing was shallow, her heart still hammering from the realization that she had been left behind. Her mother had once told her that getting lost was like being inside a dream. You had to be careful because not everything was real. But this wasn't a dream. The rough dirt beneath her sneakers, the dry wind whipping through her tangled hair, and the growing ache in her stomach were all terrifyingly real. And then there were those eyes. The lynx hadn't moved. It remained under the shadow of the tree, its golden gaze locked onto her. Its ears twitched slightly, as if listening to the quiet sounds of the desert, but otherwise, it was still. Emily, despite her young age, understood animals in ways most people didn't. She had always preferred them over people. People talked too much, touched too much, made too many demands. Animals never did any of those things. They existed in their own space, communicating with glances, movements, and instincts. Right now, this lynx wasn't attacking her, wasn't running away. It was watching, waiting. Emily took a slow step forward, then another. Her tiny shoes scuffed against the dirt as she inched toward the creature, her hands loose at her sides. The lynx's ears flicked forward, but it didn't retreat. "Hi," she whispered. She wasn't expecting an answer, but speaking aloud made her feel less alone. The lynx blinked. Emily hesitated, unsure of what to do next. She was exhausted, her body aching from the long walk and the growing cold that settled deep in her bones. She hadn't had anything to eat or drink since earlier that morning, and the dryness in her throat made it hard to swallow. She sat down slowly, crossing her legs the way her mother had taught her during story time. The lynx shifted its weight, watching with an unreadable expression before lowering itself onto its stomach. A strange comfort settled over her. Even though she was lost in the middle of nowhere, even though she had no idea how to get back to safety, she wasn't alone anymore. The endless walk the night deepened. The desert, which had seemed lifeless in the day, came alive with unfamiliar sounds, the distant cries of coyotes, the rustling of small creatures in the dry grass, the whisper of the wind against the sand. Emily shivered. She pulled her thin jacket tighter around herself, but it did little against the cold. Her fingers trembled as she hugged her knees to her chest. The lynx watched her. It had curled its body into a tight ball, its injured paw tucked beneath it. Every now and then, its ears flicked at the sounds around them, but it didn't leave. Emily closed her eyes, trying to pretend she was anywhere but here. Maybe if she slept, she'd wake up in her old bed, and her mom would be making breakfast, humming the same soft melody she always had. But her mother was gone, and Roy had left her here on purpose. Her throat tightened, but she forced herself not to cry. Crying wouldn't help. She didn't know how long she sat there before something startled her. A noise, faint but distinct. A rumbling sound in the distance, growing louder. A truck. Her heart leaped. Emily pushed herself up, stumbling slightly as she turned toward the sound. Her small feet dug into the dirt as she ran toward the road. A flicker of hope ignited in her chest. Maybe it was someone coming to find her. Maybe Roy had changed his mind. The lynx suddenly stood, ears flat against its head, and let out a deep, warning growl. Emily hesitated, looking back. The headlights of a large, rusted pickup truck appeared over the hill, its engine growling like a predator. But something felt wrong. The vehicle wasn't slowing down. Instead, it swerved slightly, as if its driver had only just noticed the small figure standing by the road. Emily's stomach twisted. The lynx let out another low growl, stepping protectively in front of her. The truck slowed just enough for Emily to see the two men inside, both rough-looking, dressed in worn-out flannel and dusty jeans. The driver, a burly man with a scruffy beard, narrowed his eyes as he stared at her through the open window. "Well, would you look at that?" he muttered, nudging the man beside him. The passenger, thinner and with sharp features, leaned forward. "What the hell is a kid doing out here?" Emily took a cautious step back. The lynx stayed between her and the truck, tail flicking, muscles tense. The driver grinned. "You lost, sweetheart." Emily didn't answer. She knew, instinctively, that these weren't good men. "Maybe we should." The passenger started, but the lynx suddenly hissed, baring its teeth. The driver jerked back. "Damn thing looks mean." "Forget it," the other man muttered. "She's not our problem." The truck rumbled forward, kicking up another cloud of dust as it sped off down the road. Emily didn't breathe until the red taillights disappeared over the horizon. She turned back to the lynx, who was still standing protectively in front of her. "Thank you," she whispered. The lynx, of course, didn't answer. But for the first time that night, Emily didn't feel quite so afraid. The night stretched on, long and unforgiving. The cold had seeped into Emily's bones, making her entire body tremble. The oversized jacket she wore, one that had once belonged to her mother, was thin and worn, barely offering any warmth. Her fingers were stiff, her cheeks raw from the biting wind. She sat curled against a rock, knees pulled to her chest, staring up at the sky. The stars were brighter here, untouched by city lights, but they only made her feel smaller, more alone. Except she wasn't alone. The lynx, still watching her, had settled nearby, its injured paw tucked beneath its body. Emily found comfort in its quiet presence. The animal could have left at any time, but it hadn't. Maybe it was just too hurt to run away. Maybe it didn't want to. Emily didn't understand why, but she felt like they were the same somehow. Two lost souls abandoned in the middle of nowhere. She reached out, hesitating before letting her fingers brush against the animal's soft fur. The lynx tensed for a moment, but didn't move away. That was enough for her. The hunger gnawed at her stomach, sharper now, more insistent. She had eaten nothing since morning, and her throat was painfully dry. She knew she needed to find water, but she had no idea where to look. The lynx shifted beside her, its ears flicking toward the darkness. Emily stiffened. Something was moving in the night. A rustling sound, a low growl, then a howl. Coyotes. Her breath caught in her throat. She had seen them on television before, wild, hungry animals that hunted in packs. And now they were here. She glanced at the lynx. Its fur bristled, eyes locked on the darkness beyond. It let out a deep, warning growl, but the sounds only grew closer. Emily swallowed hard. She had two choices, run or hide. But where? There was nothing around them but open desert. No houses, no trees thick enough to climb, no shelter except for a few scattered boulders. The growling grew louder. Then she saw them. At least 3 sets of glowing eyes appeared in the distance, creeping closer, bodies low to the ground. The coyotes were thin, ribs pressing against their fur. Desperate, hungry. The lynx stood, forcing weight onto its injured paw. It let out a deep, guttural snarl, its tail flicking. The coyotes hesitated. Emily knew enough about animals to understand. They were testing her and the lynx, trying to decide if the risk of attacking was worth the reward. Her heart pounded. She had no weapons, no way to protect herself. And then, out of instinct, she did something she had seen her mother do when she needed to scare something away. She raised her arms, made herself look bigger, and screamed. A loud, piercing sound that echoed through the night. The coyotes flinched. The lynx took the opportunity to lunge forward, swiping its claws through the air. It was enough. The coyotes turned, slinking back into the darkness, disappearing as suddenly as they had come. Emily collapsed onto the ground, her chest rising and falling in sharp breaths. Her hands shook, and she felt lightheaded from fear. The lynx stood for a few more moments, watching the darkness, before slowly lowering itself back onto its stomach. Emily turned to it, her voice hoarse. "You saved me." The lynx blinked, saying nothing. For the first time that night, Emily smiled, just a little. The search for water. The sky was beginning to shift from deep black to dark blue, signaling the slow approach of dawn. Emily's limbs ached from exhaustion, but she knew she couldn't stay here. She needed water. She stood, legs unsteady, and looked down at the lynx. "Come with me," she asked. The animal didn't move. Emily sighed and started walking. She didn't know where she was going, only that she had to keep moving. The lynx hesitated but eventually followed, limping slightly. The desert stretched endlessly before them. The sun had yet to rise fully, but the land was already bathed in soft light, the red and gold hues of the desert more vibrant now. Emily's breath came in small, shallow gasps as she trudged forward. She didn't know how long she walked before she saw something in the distance. A cluster of bushes, small but green. Her mother had once told her that where there was green, there was water. Her legs moved faster now, stumbling over loose rocks and sand. The lynx followed closely, its ears alert. When she reached the bushes, her heart leaped. Water. Not much, just a shallow pool left from recent rain, but it was enough. She dropped to her knees, cupping the water in her hands and bringing it to her cracked lips. The first sip burned, her throat raw from hours of dryness, but she forced herself to drink slowly. The lynx moved beside her, lowering its head to lap at the water. For the first time since being left behind, Emily felt like she had a chance. She wasn't safe yet, but she was alive, and that had to count for something. The first rays of sunlight crept over the horizon, painting the Arizona desert in soft hues of pink and gold. Emily sat beside the small pool of water, watching the lynx lap at the surface, its injured paw trembling slightly as it shifted its weight. Her throat still burned, but the water had given her enough strength to think clearly again. She was lost, she knew that now. Roy was gone. He wasn't coming back, and no one else knew she was out here. The thought made her stomach tighten. She needed to find help. But where? The desert stretched endlessly around her, a sea of dry land and scattered rock formations. She had no idea which direction led to safety. The lynx lifted its head suddenly, ears pricking forward. Emily followed its gaze, her heart sinking. A new sound had emerged in the distance. An engine. Her first instinct was hope. Maybe someone was looking for her. Maybe a kind stranger would stop and help her. But something about the sound made the lynx uneasy. It stood, eyes locked on the approaching vehicle, tail flicking in agitation. Emily hesitated. Then she saw it. A rusted pickup truck, similar to Roy's but older, bouncing along the dirt road toward her. Her stomach dropped. Something told her that whoever was inside that truck was not coming to help her. She backed up, pressing herself against the rock formation behind her, barely breathing as the truck slowed to a stop a few yards away. The door creaked open. A man climbed out. He was tall and thin, with sun-worn skin and a permanent scowl etched into his face. His clothes were dusty, his boots scuffed and caked with dried mud. His sharp, beady eyes scanned the area before settling on Emily. "Well, now," he drawled, his voice raspy from years of smoking. "Ain't this a surprise?" Emily didn't move. The lynx growled low in its throat, stepping in front of her. The man smirked. "What's a little thing like you doing all the way out here?" Emily pressed herself harder against the rock, willing herself to disappear. He took a slow step forward. "You lost, sweetheart." The lynx bared its teeth. The man's smirk faded. He looked at the animal more closely, his expression shifting into something darker. "Well, look at that," he muttered. "Ain't every day you find a beauty like this just sitting out here." His hand moved toward his belt. Emily's breath caught when she saw the glint of a gun. The lynx tensed, its growl growing deeper. "Easy now, kitty," the man said, gripping the gun's handle. "I ain't gonna hurt ya." Emily's hands curled into fists. The lynx wasn't just some animal to her. It had saved her life. And now this man wanted to take it away. No, she whispered. The man's head snapped toward her. What did you say? Emily swallowed hard, forcing herself to meet his eyes. No, the man chuckled. Ain't up to you, darling. He reached for the gun, but before he could pull it free, the lynx lunged. A snarl ripped through the air as the animal sprang forward, its claws slashing at his arm. The man yelped, stumbling back as he grabbed at the fresh wound. Blood seeped through his shirt, and his expression twisted in pain and rage. You little. The lynx didn't wait for him to recover. It struck again, knocking him off balance. His gun fell into the dirt, kicking up a small cloud of dust. Emily moved. She didn't think, she just acted. Her tiny hands grabbed the gun before the man could, her heart pounding so hard it hurt. The man froze. His eyes flicked to the weapon in her hands, then back to her face. For the first time, he looked uncertain. Now, kid, he said slowly, raising his hands. Let's not do anything stupid. Emily's hands trembled. The gun was heavier than she expected, her fingers barely able to wrap around it. She didn't know how to use it, didn't even know if it was loaded. But the man didn't know that. She lifted the gun slightly, just like she had seen people do on TV. Go away, she said, her voice stronger than she felt. The man hesitated. Then, the lynx snarled again, stepping beside Emily, its golden eyes blazing. That was enough. The man cursed under his breath and backed away. Ain't worth the trouble, he muttered, spitting into the dirt. He turned and stomped toward his truck, climbing inside and slamming the door. Emily held her breath as the engine roared back to life. The truck reversed, tires spinning in the dust before speeding off into the distance. She didn't move until it was completely gone. Then, her hands went limp, and the gun dropped back to the ground. Her knees buckled. The lynx stepped closer, nuzzling against her arm. Emily sucked in a shaky breath. She had never been more afraid in her life. But she was still here, and she was still alive. She looked down at the lynx, pressing her forehead against its fur. Thank you, she whispered. The animal said nothing, just stood beside her, its warm body against hers. For the first time since being left behind, she didn't feel powerless. She had survived, but she knew this wasn't over. There were more dangers out there, and she had to find a way home before it was too late. The desert was quiet again, but Emily could still feel the lingering tension in the air. Her small hands trembled as she stared at the gun on the ground, dust clinging to the metal like a stain. She had never held a weapon before. She didn't know how to use it. But the way the man had looked at her, his hesitation, the way his hands had gone up in surrender, made her realize something. She wasn't helpless. For the first time since Roy had abandoned her, she felt something close to control. She wasn't just some lost, scared little girl. She had fought back, and she had won. Emily let out a slow breath, then turned to the lynx. The animal was still standing beside her, its injured paw tucked close, its golden eyes sharp and alert. She didn't know why the lynx had stayed with her when it could have run away. But deep down, she was grateful. I think we need to go, she whispered. The lynx flicked its ears, as if agreeing. Emily glanced around, trying to decide which way to go. There was no road, no landmarks, no signs to guide her. The desert stretched endlessly in every direction, vast and unyielding. She bit her lip. She couldn't stay here. She needed to find people. But where? Her mother had always told her that if she ever got lost, she should look for signs of water or follow power lines. But there were no power lines out here. Just rock, sand, and the scorching sun. Her gaze fell on the man's footprints, leading back the way he had come. Maybe he had been driving from somewhere nearby. Emily hesitated. Following the footsteps of a man who had almost shot her felt wrong. But it was the only clue she had. Her stomach twisted with hunger. She didn't have much time. Taking a deep breath, she adjusted the straps of her small backpack, the only thing Roy had let her keep before shoving her out of the truck, and started walking. The long journey through the desert, the heat was relentless. The moment the sun rose higher, it was like fire pressing against her skin. Sweat dripped down her back, soaking the collar of her jacket. The air shimmered with heat waves, making the horizon waver like a cruel illusion. Emily pushed forward, one foot in front of the other. The lynx followed close behind, its steps slow and careful. After what felt like hours, Emily stumbled. She caught herself before falling completely, but her knees scraped against the rough ground, stinging with fresh cuts. She gritted her teeth, forcing herself back up. I have to keep going. Her mother's voice echoed in her head, soft and gentle. If you ever feel lost, Emmy, just take a deep breath and find one thing to focus on. One step at a time. One step at a time. She swallowed against the dryness in her throat and forced herself forward. The lynx moved beside her, its golden eyes scanning the desert as if searching for danger. Emily was grateful for its presence. It made her feel less alone. The hunger and the hunt by midday. Emily's stomach was cramping painfully. The water she had found earlier was long gone, and she could feel her energy draining fast. She needed food. But where could she find food in a place like this? The lynx suddenly stopped, ears flicking. Emily froze. The animal lowered itself, eyes locked on something ahead. Emily followed its gaze and spotted movement in the dry grass. A small rabbit, sniffing at the ground. Her stomach clenched. The lynx tensed, muscles coiling as it prepared to pounce. Emily's breath caught as she realized what was about to happen. And then, the lynx sprang forward. The rabbit darted, but it wasn't fast enough. The lynx moved like lightning, its injured paw barely slowing it down. In a blur of movement, it clamped its jaws around the rabbit's neck. Emily flinched at the sharp cry before silence fell again. She stared. Her stomach churned. She had never seen an animal kill before. The lynx returned to her side, the rabbit hanging limply from its jaws. Emily turned away, closing her eyes. She knew the lynx had to eat. It was a wild animal. But the thought of eating a rabbit, one that had been alive just seconds ago, made her stomach twist. The lynx dropped the rabbit at her feet and looked up at her expectantly. Emily hesitated. She was starving. She had seen people cook rabbits before, in movies, but she didn't know how to do it herself. She didn't have fire, didn't have a knife. But then she remembered something else her mother had said. When you have no other choice, survival means doing things you never thought you could. Emily took a deep breath. She wasn't going to die out here. And if that meant eating something she never thought she would, then so be it. She needed to survive. The first real sign of hope hours later, after moving forward step by step, Emily saw something that made her heart race. A road. Not a highway, not a big street, but a dirt road cutting through the landscape. Emily's legs trembled as she ran toward it, her breath coming in sharp gasps. The lynx followed closely. She reached the edge of the road and looked in both directions. Nothing. No cars. No houses. Just the endless stretch of desert. Her chest tightened. What if no one ever came? She sank to her knees, exhaustion weighing her down. The lynx nudged her gently, its warm fur brushing against her arm. Emily reached out, running her fingers through its soft coat. We'll be okay, she whispered, even if she didn't fully believe it. Then a sound, a faint rumbling in the distance. Emily's head snapped up. A car. A real, actual car was coming. Her heart pounded as she scrambled to her feet, waving her arms. Help, please. The vehicle grew closer, kicking up dust. Emily's breath caught as she saw the driver's face through the windshield. A man. A stranger. Would he stop? Would he help? Or was she walking into another danger? Her heart pounded. She had no choice. She had to take the risk. She stepped into the road, praying this time. Help had finally come. The sound of the approaching vehicle roared in Emily's ears, its deep rumble shaking the dry earth beneath her feet. Dust billowed in the air as the truck, a large, older model with faded red paint, sped toward her. Emily stood in the middle of the road, her tiny arms waving frantically. Please stop, she whispered under her breath, her throat too dry to call out properly. Her heart pounded against her ribs. Would the driver see her? Would they care? The truck didn't slow. For one terrifying second, Emily thought it would run her over. She was just about to dive out of the way when, with a screech of tires, the vehicle skidded to a halt just a few feet in front of her. The force of the stop sent up a thick cloud of dust, making her cough violently as she staggered backward. The lynx, crouched in the shadows near the bushes, let out a warning growl. The driver's door swung open, and a man stepped out. Emily held her breath. He was tall and broad, with sun-weathered skin and a beard streaked with gray. His boots were scuffed with dirt, his flannel shirt unbuttoned at the collar. His piercing blue eyes locked onto her, widening in shock. What in God's name? He muttered, stepping closer. His voice was deep, rough, but not immediately threatening. Emily's hands trembled at her sides. She wanted to speak, but no words came out. The man took another step forward. "Kid, you okay?" Emily opened her mouth, but her throat was too dry. She only managed a hoarse whisper. "Help." The man frowned, his gaze scanning her from head to toe. His expression darkened when he noticed her scraped knees, dust-covered clothes, and the way she swayed slightly from exhaustion. "Where are your parents?" he asked. Emily flinched at the word. She didn't have parents. Not anymore. Tears burned the corners of her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She couldn't cry. She had to be strong. The man exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. "Jesus, you're lost, aren't you?" Emily nodded. The lynx let out another low growl from behind her. The man froze. His hand twitched toward his belt. Emily realized too late that he had a gun holstered there. "Wait," she blurted out, her voice finally breaking free. The man stopped. Emily turned and quickly placed herself between him and the lynx. "Don't hurt her," she said, her voice small but firm. The man stared at her, then at the wild animal behind her. His brows furrowed in confusion. "That thing with you?" he asked. Emily hesitated, then nodded. "She's my friend." The man exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "Hell, this just keeps getting stranger." He crouched slightly, lowering his voice as if talking to a frightened deer. "Listen, kid, that's a wild animal. You can't." "She saved me," Emily interrupted. "She protected me." The man studied her for a long moment. Then, with a sigh, he muttered, "Damn it," and rubbed his temples. He looked down the empty road, then back at Emily. "All right, let's get you somewhere safe." He stepped toward the truck and opened the passenger door. Emily hesitated. She had no idea who this man was. But what choice did she have? She looked at the lynx, then back at the truck. Slowly, she climbed in. The ride to safety or danger? The inside of the truck smelled like old leather and cigarette smoke. The seat was cracked from years of wear, and a faded Arizona Ranger's cap sat on the dashboard. The man climbed in beside her, shutting the door with a heavy thud. He turned the key, and the engine rumbled back to life. Emily sat stiffly, gripping the seat beneath her. The man glanced at her, then reached for a water bottle sitting in the cup holder. "Here." She hesitated. "It's clean," he assured her. Her thirst won. She grabbed it, twisted the cap off, and took deep gulps. The cold water was heaven, soothing the rawness in her throat. The man watched her carefully. After a moment, he asked, "What's your name, kid?" Emily lowered the bottle. Her fingers curled around the plastic as she mumbled, "Emily." The man nodded. "I'm Jack Lawson." He didn't ask her last name. She was grateful for that. Jack focused on the road ahead. "Where were you headed?" Emily didn't answer. Jack sighed. "All right, let's try something easier. Where's your folks?" She swallowed hard. "Gone." Jack glanced at her, his brows drawing together. He didn't push. "All right," he muttered. The truck rumbled along the dirt road, bumping over rocks and dry patches of land. After a few minutes, Emily took a deep breath. "My stepdad left me," she whispered. Jack's grip on the steering wheel tightened. She saw his jaw clench, the muscle ticking beneath his beard. "Left you?" he repeated, his voice dangerously low. Emily nodded. "On the road." Jack inhaled sharply through his nose. For a long time, he didn't speak. Then, "That son of a bitch." Emily flinched at the curse, but she wasn't scared. Jack wasn't angry at her. He was angry for her. He let out a slow breath, forcing himself to relax. "All right, Emily," he said, voice calmer now. "We're gonna figure this out." She wasn't sure what that meant, but something about the way he said it made her believe him. For the first time in days, she felt a flicker of hope. But then, a bright light flashed in the side mirror. Emily turned. A second truck was speeding up behind them. Jack saw it too. His expression darkened. Emily's stomach dropped. It was the same men from before, the ones who had wanted to take the lynx. Jack muttered a curse under his breath and pressed harder on the gas. The truck lurched forward, kicking up a trail of dust behind them. Emily's heart pounded. She gripped the seat, her nails digging into the fabric. "What do they want?" she whispered. Jack didn't take his eyes off the road. "Nothing good." The second truck was getting closer. Emily felt the cold grip of fear squeeze her chest. Jack's hands were steady on the wheel, but she could see the tension in his shoulders. "Hold on, kid," he murmured. Emily barely had time to brace herself before Jack swerved hard to the left, sending the truck off the road and into the desert. The chase was on, and Emily knew this wasn't over yet. The truck jolted violently as Jack swerved off the dirt road and into the open desert, tires kicking up a whirlwind of dust and debris. Emily gripped the seat so tightly her knuckles turned white. The lynx, still crouched near the open window, let out a deep, warning growl, its golden eyes flicking between the speeding vehicle behind them and the rugged terrain ahead. Jack's hands were steady on the wheel, but his jaw was tight, muscles tensed with focus. He stole a quick glance in the rearview mirror, his sharp blue eyes narrowing. "They're gaining on us," he muttered. Emily's stomach twisted. She turned, peering through the dusty window. The second truck, a black, rusted Ford with a dented front bumper, was closing the distance fast. Behind the wheel, the thin, sharp-featured man from before was gripping the steering wheel, a dark grin stretching across his sunburned face. Beside him, the bullier man, his arms still wrapped in a torn cloth from where the lynx had slashed him, was rummaging through the glove compartment, pulling something out. A gun. Emily's breath caught in her throat. "They have a gun," she whispered, barely able to get the words out. Jack cursed under his breath. His fingers twitched toward his own holster, but never left the wheel. "That complicates things." The engine roared as he pushed the gas pedal to the floor, forcing the old truck to its limits. The speedometer climbed higher, but the terrain was working against them. The open desert wasn't meant for fast driving. Rocks, dry riverbeds, and uneven ground made every turn a gamble. Jack's eyes flicked to Emily. "You buckled up, kid?" She barely had time to nod before, bang. The first gunshot rang out, shattering the air. The bullet hit just behind the truck, kicking up dirt. Emily flinched, covering her head instinctively. The lynx let out a sharp snarl, its body low and tense, ready to spring if needed. Jack gritted his teeth. "All right, you sons of bitches," he growled. "You want to play?" Without warning, he yanked the wheel hard to the right. The truck veered sharply, bouncing over a small embankment and sending the tires skidding over loose gravel. The lynx let out a startled growl as Emily was thrown sideways, barely catching herself on the door handle. The black truck followed, but not as smoothly. Its heavier weight caused it to slide wildly, fishtailing before regaining control. Jack saw the opportunity. His eyes flicked ahead, a dry washout, a deep trench carved into the desert floor from flash floods. If he timed it right, he tightened his grip on the wheel. "Hold on," he warned. Emily barely had time to react before Jack gunned it, sending the truck flying over the edge of the washout. For a split second, they were airborne. Emily's stomach dropped. Then, a bone-jarring impact. The truck hit the ground hard, bouncing violently before Jack regained control. Emily gasped for breath. Her whole body rattled from the landing. But Jack didn't stop. He kept going. The black truck wasn't so lucky. The men had tried to follow, but their vehicle was heavier, slower. As they hit the edge of the washout, their front bumper slammed into the trench, sending the vehicle into a wild spin. Emily turned just in time to see the black truck flip onto its side. A thick cloud of dust erupted into the air, swallowing the wreckage. Jack didn't slow down, not until they were miles away. Only then did he let out a long breath, his hands finally loosening on the wheel. Emily exhaled shakily. Are they dead?" Jack shook his head. "Doubt it. But they sure as hell won't be chasing us anytime soon." The lynx, still bristling with tension, let out a soft huff, its tail flicking. Jack glanced at the wildcat. "I'm starting to think you might be good luck, cat." Emily reached out, running her fingers through the lynx's fur. It was still trembling slightly, but its gaze was calm, steady. "We're safe now," she murmured. For the first time in days, she almost believed it. The road to somewhere after another half hour of driving, Jack finally slowed the truck. The sun was higher now, baking the desert in golden heat. Emily's body ached, from exhaustion, from hunger, from fear. She glanced up at Jack. "Where are we going?" Jack sighed, rubbing a hand down his face. "Well, first, we need food. Then, I need to figure out what the hell I'm going to do with you." Emily's stomach clenched. "What do you mean?" Jack looked at her, his expression unreadable. "You got family anywhere?" Her chest tightened. She shook her head. "No." Jack exhaled sharply. "Figures." Silence stretched between them. Then, softer, he asked, "What about that stepdad of yours?" Emily stiffened. Jack saw the way her shoulders tensed, the way her fingers curled into her lap. And he understood. "All right," he muttered. "Forget I asked." He adjusted his grip on the wheel, staring ahead at the endless stretch of desert road. "I got a place up north," he said finally. Small cabin, middle of nowhere. Nothing fancy, but it's safe. Emily turned to him, hope flickering in her tired eyes. Can we go there? Jack hesitated. Then he nodded. Yeah, kid, we can go there. Relief flooded her chest. But just as she thought things might be okay, Jack frowned. His grip on the wheel tightened again. Emily followed his gaze, and her blood ran cold. In the rearview mirror, a third truck had appeared, and this one was even bigger than the last. Jack muttered a curse. Emily's heart pounded. She had thought they were safe, but she had been wrong. The danger wasn't over yet, and the fight for survival was far from finished. The third truck loomed in the distance, its massive frame kicking up a thick cloud of dust as it barreled toward them. Emily's breath caught in her throat. The other men, they had been dangerous enough. But this truck was bigger, heavier, more powerful, and it wasn't slowing down. Jack's hands clenched around the wheel, his jaw tight with focus. Son of a bitch, he muttered under his breath. Emily turned, panic rising in her chest. Who are they? Jack didn't answer right away. His eyes stayed locked on the road ahead. Then, with a grim expression, he muttered, Worse. Emily's fingers curled around the edge of the seat. Worse? How could they be worse? The lynx shifted beside her, ears flattening against its head. Its golden eyes were locked onto the approaching vehicle, its tail flicking in agitation. Jack took a deep breath. All right, kid, he said, voice low and steady. I need you to listen to me, and I need you to do exactly what I say. Emily swallowed hard. Okay. Jack reached behind the seat, grabbing something heavy and metal. A shotgun. Her heart pounded. He checked the ammo, then set it across his lap. If this goes bad, you stay low. Got it. Emily nodded quickly, her fingers shaking. The truck behind them was getting closer. Much closer. Jack's jaw tightened. Damn it, I didn't want to do this today, he muttered. Then, without warning, he slammed on the brakes. Emily barely had time to react before the world jerked violently. The truck skidded, tires screeching against the dirt road. The force threw her forward against the seatbelt, her breath knocking out of her lungs. The lynx let out a startled yowl, claws digging into the seat. Behind them, the pursuing truck swerved hard to avoid crashing into them, but the sudden maneuver threw it off balance. Emily turned just in time to see the massive vehicle tilt to one side. For a second, it hung there, wheels off the ground. Then, it flipped. Metal crunched. Glass shattered. The truck tumbled, rolling down an embankment, before landing in a heap of twisted steel and broken parts. Silence. Jack exhaled sharply. Well, that worked. Emily's hands shook as she stared at the wreckage. The dust still lingered in the air, thick and choking. Are they dead? She whispered. Jack was already shifting the truck back into gear. Don't care, he said gruffly. We're leaving. Emily nodded quickly. She didn't care either. She just wanted to get away. The hidden threat for the next hour, they drove in silence. The road stretched endlessly ahead, winding through the barren landscape. Emily leaned her head against the window, exhaustion pressing heavy on her small frame. Her body ached from the stress, from the fear, from the endless tension that never seemed to leave her chest. She closed her eyes, trying to ignore the hunger gnawing at her stomach. Jack glanced at her. You holding up, kid? Emily nodded weakly. Just tired. Jack sighed. Yeah, I know the feeling. The lynx had curled up on the seat between them, its breathing slow and steady. Emily reached out, stroking its soft fur. Jack adjusted his grip on the wheel. We'll stop soon. Find a place to rest. Emily didn't argue. She didn't care where they stopped. She just wanted to feel safe again. But then, Jack stiffened. Emily frowned. What? Jack didn't answer. Instead, he slowed the truck. Emily sat up straighter, heart pounding. What's wrong? Jack's grip on the wheel tightened. His blue eyes flicked to the side mirror, his expression turning dark. Emily turned to look, and her blood ran cold. Another truck. This one was farther back, barely visible through the heat waves of the desert. But it was there, following them. Emily's voice trembled. I thought we lost them. Jack's jaw clenched. So did I. His fingers tapped against the steering wheel, his mind racing. They're tracking us. Emily's stomach twisted. How? Jack exhaled through his nose. They got ways. Emily swallowed hard. Jack was quiet for a moment. Then, he said, we need to disappear. Emily frowned. How? Jack's eyes flicked to the rocky cliffs ahead. We're going off-road. Emily's pulse spiked. Off-road, she echoed. Jack pressed his foot down on the gas. Hold on. Before Emily could react, he yanked the wheel hard to the left. The truck veered off the main road and into the open desert. Emily gritted her teeth as the vehicle bounced violently, the uneven terrain making every movement jarring and unpredictable. The lynx let out a soft growl, digging its claws into the seat. The truck behind them, still distant but gaining, followed. Jack muttered a curse. Persistent bastards. Emily gripped the dashboard, her breath shallow. What do we do? Jack's eyes flicked ahead. Then he saw it. A cave, tucked into the side of a rocky outcrop, barely noticeable from a distance. Jack's mouth set into a hard line. That'll do. Without another word, he aimed straight for it. The truck lurched forward, speeding toward the cave's entrance. Behind them, the other vehicle followed. Emily's heart pounded. They weren't going to make it. The cave was too small. The truck was too big. Then, Jack made his move. At the last second, he jerked the wheel, sending the truck into a sharp, skidding turn. The tires screamed against the dirt. The vehicle spun and slammed into the entrance of the cave, blocking it off completely. Dust erupted into the air. Silence. For a long moment, Emily didn't move, didn't breathe. Then, Jack exhaled. He turned to Emily. We're in. Her heart still pounded against her ribs, but she nodded. Jack opened his door. Come on, kid. We need to move. Emily scrambled out after him, clutching the lynx to her chest. Inside the cave, the air was cooler, the shadows stretching deep into the earth. Jack grabbed a flashlight from the truck and clicked it on. We'll stay here for the night, he murmured. Let them think we disappeared. Emily shivered, hugging herself. Jack glanced at her. His tough expression softened slightly. You did good, kid. Emily blinked. I didn't do anything. Jack huffed. You survived. That's enough. She looked down at the lynx, still nestled in her arms. She had survived. For now. But something told her this wasn't over. Not yet. The cave swallowed them whole. Emily stumbled forward, her small hands gripping Jack's sleeve as they moved deeper into the dark, damp tunnel. The cool air inside was a sharp contrast to the blazing Arizona heat outside, and for the first time in days, she didn't feel like she was suffocating under the weight of the sun. Jack led the way, his flashlight casting a narrow beam along the rocky walls. The ground beneath their feet was uneven, loose gravel crunching with every step. The lynx padded silently beside Emily, its golden eyes alert, ears twitching at every sound. Jack stopped suddenly. Emily nearly bumped into him. What is it? She whispered. Jack didn't answer right away. His gaze was locked on something ahead, a faint, metallic glimmer reflecting in the flashlight's beam. Emily's stomach tightened. Something wasn't right. Jack took a cautious step forward, shining the light across the cave floor. A cold dread settled in Emily's chest when she saw it. Boot prints. Fresh ones. Someone had been here. Recently. Jack's jaw tightened. His hand drifted toward his belt, where his gun rested. Emily swallowed hard. Jack. He held up a hand, signaling her to stay quiet. Slowly, he crouched, running his fingers over the footprints in the dirt. He pressed lightly against the disturbed ground, then muttered under his breath, still soft. Emily's pulse quickened. That meant whoever had left them wasn't far. Jack turned to her, his voice low. Stay close. Emily didn't need to be told twice. They moved forward carefully, deeper into the cave. The air smelled damp, a mixture of earth and something else, something faintly metallic. Emily frowned. It smelled like rust. No, not rust. Blood. A wave of nausea hit her, and she instinctively reached for the lynx, pressing her fingers into its fur. The animal stayed close, silent but tense. Jack lifted the flashlight higher. That's when they saw it. A metal cage. Emily's breath hitched. The cage was large, its thick bars rusted but still sturdy. Inside, something moved. Jack stepped closer, raising his gun slightly. Emily peered around him, her heart hammering in her chest. A dog. Thin, trembling, covered in old scars and fresh wounds. Emily gasped. The dog let out a weak whimper, shifting slightly but too exhausted to stand. Its ribs protruded beneath its patchy fur, eyes sunken and dull. Oh no, Emily whispered. Jack cursed under his breath. His expression darkened. This ain't just some cave, he muttered. This is a damn holding pen. Emily's stomach twisted. Holding pen. Jack ran a hand through his hair, exhaling sharply. They weren't just tracking us, kid. They were on a hunt. Emily felt sick. She turned back to the dog, its frail body barely clinging to life. How many more animals had been trapped here? How many hadn't survived? Jack's eyes flicked toward the back of the cave. We need to move fast. He crouched beside the cage, examining the rusted latch. Gotta get this thing open. Emily hesitated, then asked the question weighing on her mind. What if they come back? Jack's expression turned grim. They will. The sound of footsteps. Jack worked quickly, using his knife to pry at the lock. It was old, rusted, and stubborn, but after a few harsh twists, the latch snapped open with a metallic crack. The dog didn't move at first. Emily knelt beside it, reaching out carefully. It's okay, she whispered. You're safe now. The dog lifted its head weakly, sniffing at her hand. Jack turned toward the entrance. We need to, he stopped. Then, Emily heard it. Footsteps. Her breath caught in her throat. Jack grabbed her wrist and pulled her back against the cave wall, clicking off the flashlight. Darkness swallowed them. Emily barely dared to breathe. The lynx crouched low beside her, silent as a shadow. The footsteps grew louder. Then voices. Trucks still outside, a man muttered. Another voice, gruffer, colder. That means they're inside. Emily's fingers dug into Jack's arm. They had found them. Jack leaned in close, his voice barely above a whisper. When I say run, you run. You hear me? Emily's heart pounded so hard it hurt. But she nodded. Jack shifted, his gun held tight. The men were getting closer. Their flashlight beams cut through the darkness. Emily's breath trembled. They were almost to the cage. One of the men cursed. Damn, lock's busted. The other voice turned sharp. They let it out. Find them. Emily couldn't wait anymore. She turned to Jack. Now. Jack exhaled. Then run. Emily sprinted. Her legs moved before her brain could catch up. The lynx bolted beside her, its muscles tense with urgency. Behind her, shouting. Then, gunfire. A bullet slammed into the cave wall, sending stone fragments flying. Emily bit down on a scream, pushing her legs faster. Jack was right behind her, his heavy boots pounding against the ground. The cave twisted into a sharp curve, leading toward a narrow opening. A way out. Emily lunged for it. Sunlight burst through the cracks. She felt the rush of open air, her body breaking free from the suffocating dark. Then, a hand grabbed her. She screamed. Strong fingers yanked her back, nails digging into her arm. The lynx let out a feral snarl, launching itself at the attacker. The man shouted in pain. Jack spun, gun raised. Bang! The man dropped. Emily stumbled free. Jack grabbed her, shoving her forward. Go. Keep moving. She didn't hesitate. She ran. Ran until the cave was far behind them. Ran until the gunfire faded into the distance. Ran until her legs collapsed beneath her. Jack knelt beside her, gripping her shoulders. You hurt. Emily shook her head, gasping for breath. Jack exhaled, running a hand down his face. Then, he did something she hadn't expected. He laughed. A rough, breathless chuckle. Emily blinked, confused. Why are you laughing? Jack shook his head. Because we're still alive, kid. Emily let out a small, shaky laugh. Then, she turned to the lynx, who was watching them with quiet understanding. She reached out, pressing her forehead to the animals. Thank you, she whispered. Jack stood, reloading his gun. We gotta keep moving, he muttered. This ain't over yet. Emily swallowed hard. She knew he was right. But for now, just for a second, she let herself breathe. Emily's lungs burned as she struggled to catch her breath. The cave was far behind them now, but her body still trembled from the chase. The adrenaline had faded, leaving behind exhaustion so heavy it felt like chains dragging her down. Jack crouched beside her, his hands on his knees, still gripping his gun. His blue eyes darted around the open desert, scanning for movement. The lynx was near Emily, pacing back and forth, its golden eyes flicking toward the cave's entrance, as if expecting more danger to come bursting through at any moment. They weren't safe yet. Jack let out a sharp exhale. We need to move, he said, voice gruff. Emily wiped sweat from her brow, nodding. Where? Jack glanced toward the horizon. In the distance, the Arizona landscape stretched out in endless waves of dry land, scattered rock formations, and patches of low shrubs. There was no sign of civilization, no roads, no buildings. Only emptiness. Jack's jaw clenched. North. We keep heading north. Emily frowned. There's nothing out here. Jack turned to her, eyes sharp. There's something. A place. My place. Emily hesitated. She had heard him mention it before, a cabin, somewhere isolated. But now, after everything, doubt gnawed at the back of her mind. Jack must have seen it in her face. His expression softened slightly. I know you're scared, kid, but we don't got much of a choice. He nodded toward the horizon. That way is the only way we don't run into those bastards again. Emily swallowed hard. She knew he was right. She looked at the lynx. It stared back at her, its body tense but waiting. Emily took a breath. Okay. The trek through the desert, they walked for hours. The sun rose higher, the heat pressing down like a weight on their shoulders. Emily's legs ached with every step, her small feet kicking up puffs of dust as she followed Jack. The lynx stayed close, its injured paw making it limp slightly, but it didn't fall behind. Jack had given Emily the last of the water from his truck before they had abandoned it, but it was already gone. Her lips were dry, her throat scratchy. Jack, she rasped. I'm thirsty. Jack glanced down at her. He let out a slow breath and knelt, pulling a small knife from his belt. Emily's eyes widened as he walked over to a short, thick cactus. With a quick, practiced motion, he sliced into it. Clear liquid dripped from the cut. Jack turned, holding out a piece of the cactus flesh. Here. It ain't much, but it'll help. Emily took it hesitantly, bringing it to her lips. The taste was bitter, but as soon as the moisture hit her tongue, relief spread through her dry throat. Jack cut another piece, handing it to the lynx. The animal sniffed it, then licked the moisture before tearing into it with sharp teeth. Emily watched, amazed. How did you know how to do that? Jack smirked slightly. Spend enough time out here. You learn what's useful. Emily chewed the cactus slowly. It wasn't great, but it was better than nothing. After a few minutes, Jack stood and motioned for them to keep moving. We need to find cover before dark, he said. Emily nodded, wiping sweat from her forehead. They walked, and walked, and walked. The desert stretched on endlessly. The heat made the horizon shimmer, playing tricks on Emily's eyes. Several times she thought she saw water in the distance, only for it to vanish when they got closer. She was so tired. Her legs burned. Her head throbbed. But she kept going, one step at a time, like her mother had always told her. The remains of a ghost town by late afternoon, Emily thought she might collapse. Then she saw it. A cluster of buildings in the distance, half buried in the sand. Jack slowed. Well, I'll be damned. Emily blinked. What is that? Jack studied it carefully. Looks like an old mining town. Emily frowned. Mining? Jack nodded. Yeah. Arizona's full of towns that used to be something until the mines dried up. He scanned the horizon. It might have shelter. Emily's heart lifted at the word. Shelter. She picked up the pace, moving faster toward the crumbling buildings. The lynx stayed close, ears twitching. As they got closer, Emily saw that the buildings were in bad shape. The wooden walls were cracked, roofs sagging inward. An old saloon sign creaked in the breeze, the letters barely visible under layers of dust. Jack eyed the structures. Stay close. Could be snakes in there. Emily shivered. Snakes. Right. Jack stepped into the largest building first, gun drawn. Emily and the lynx followed, peering inside. The saloon was empty. Broken chairs were scattered across the floor. An old bar, covered in years of dust, stretched across the back wall. The air smelled like mold and dry wood. Jack exhaled. It'll do for tonight. Emily's legs nearly gave out in relief. She sank onto one of the less broken chairs, wiping her forehead. The lynx padded around the room, sniffing the corners. Jack crouched beside her. You all right, kid? Emily nodded weakly. Just tired. Jack sighed. Yeah, me too. He stood, stretching his back. I'll check the place. Make sure we're alone. Emily swallowed. What if? Jack gave her a look. Then we handle it. Emily didn't argue. She pulled her knees to her chest as Jack disappeared deeper into the building. The lynx curled up beside her, its warmth comforting against her side. For the first time in days, she felt safe. But something gnawed at the back of her mind. Jack had said the men wouldn't stop looking for them. And if that was true, how long could they really stay hidden? The distant howl night fell fast. The desert turned cold, the heat of the day vanishing into a sharp, bone-chilling breeze. Jack had found an old oil lantern and managed to get it working, casting a dim glow over the room. Emily sat beside the lynx, wrapped in Jack's old jacket, her eyelids heavy. She was almost asleep when a howl. Not from a coyote. Something deeper. Emily's eyes flew open. Jack was already up, gun in hand. The lynx had lifted its head, ears perked, body tense. Emily's heart pounded. What was that? Jack's expression darkened. Not a damn coyote, he murmured. Emily's stomach dropped. She turned toward the open doorway, staring out into the endless darkness. Somewhere out there, something was looking for them. And this time, they might not escape. The distant howl sent a shiver down Emily's spine. She hugged Jack's jacket tighter around herself, her small hands clutching the worn fabric as if it could shield her from whatever was out there. The lynx was rigid, its ears flicking back, tail stiff. Its golden eyes were locked on the open doorway, scanning the darkness beyond. Jack stood motionless, gun raised, his sharp blue eyes narrowed. His body was tense, not in fear, but in readiness. Emily swallowed hard. Jack, what was that? Jack didn't answer right away. He exhaled through his nose, then finally muttered, "Trouble." The sound of footsteps crunched outside. Emily's breath caught in her throat. Jack moved fast. He grabbed Emily's wrist and yanked her behind him, his grip firm but not rough. His other hand tightened around his gun, finger hovering over the trigger. The lynx let out a low growl, pressing its body close to Emily's leg. A shadow shifted near the broken doorway. Jack lifted his gun higher. "Whoever you are, you got one chance to walk away." Silence. Then a voice. "Relax, cowboy." Emily stiffened. She knew that voice. It was the man from the cave, the one Jack had shot. The man stepped into view, moving slowly, his silhouette cutting through the dim moonlight. His left arm hung limply at his side, blood staining the sleeve of his jacket. Jack didn't lower his gun. The man smirked. "Nice shot back there," he muttered. "Hurts like hell." Jack's voice was cold. "Keep talking, and I'll give you another one." The man chuckled. "Relax. I ain't here to fight." Jack's expression didn't change. "Yeah? Then why the hell are you here?" The man shifted his weight. "Because I got nowhere else to go." Emily frowned. "What do you mean?" The man exhaled, shaking his head. "Your little stunt in that cave? You didn't just piss off a bunch of nobodies." He glanced at Jack. "You know who you took out back there?" Jack's grip on the gun tightened. The man let out a humorless chuckle. "You think those guys were just random poachers? They were part of something bigger. And now..." He spread his good arm. "Now they want all of us dead." Emily's stomach twisted. Jack didn't move. "Why should I believe you?" The man shrugged. "You don't have to. But they ain't gonna stop until they find you." "Find her." His gaze flicked toward Emily. "And that cat of hers? That thing's got a price tag bigger than you can imagine." The lynx let out a low snarl. Jack's jaw ticked. "And what? You're here to warn us?" The man smirked. "No. I'm here 'cause I figure I got a better shot staying alive with you than without you." Jack stared at him for a long moment. Then, finally, he lowered the gun. Slightly. "Where are they?" Jack asked. The man sighed. "Few miles south. They'll be here soon." Emily's breath hitched. "We have to leave." The man scoffed. "And go where?" "They got lookouts on every damn road out of here." Jack ran a hand down his face, his mind working fast. Then, his eyes flicked to the mine shaft. Emily followed his gaze. The old mine was just behind the saloon, its entrance barely visible in the darkness. Jack's voice was quiet, steady. "We go underground." The man frowned. "You crazy?" Jack turned to him, his expression hard as stone. "You got a better idea?" Silence. Then, with a sigh, the man muttered, "Shit." Into the darkness, they moved fast. Jack grabbed an old lantern from behind the bar, shaking it to make sure it still had oil. The man followed, grumbling under his breath. Emily stayed close to Jack, her pulse racing. The lynx hesitated near the mine's entrance. It sniffed the air, ears twitching. Emily knelt beside it, whispering, "It's okay." The animal let out a slow breath, then followed her inside. Jack lit the lantern. The mine was deep, the walls narrowing as they descended. The air smelled old, thick with dust and rust. Wooden beams groaned overhead, their supports barely holding. Emily hated it, but she hated the idea of the men outside more. The man behind them, his name, as it turned out, was Travis, limped slightly as he walked, muttering complaints. "Damn place is a death trap." Jack ignored him. "Just keep moving." Emily clutched Jack's sleeve. "What if they find us?" Jack's voice was calm. "They won't." She wanted to believe him. She really did. But then, Gunfire. A bullet ripped through the mine entrance. Travis cursed. They're here. Jack killed the lantern. Darkness swallowed them whole. Emily held her breath. Footsteps echoed above them. The voices of men, angry, searching. Jack pressed a hand to Emily's shoulder, keeping her still. A flashlight beam swept across the tunnel. Emily clenched her fists. The lynx crouched low, tail flicking. Travis shifted beside her, whispering, "If they see us, we're dead." Jack didn't move, didn't breathe. Neither did Emily. The footsteps got closer. Then, a creaking sound. A beam snapped overhead. The mine shuddered. Emily's stomach dropped. Jack's eyes went wide. "Run!" The collapse of the mine exploded into chaos. Emily bolted forward, Jack's hand on her back as they tore through the darkness. The lynx leaped ahead, guiding the way. Travis stumbled behind them. The ceiling caved in. A wall of rock and dust crashed down behind them, swallowing the tunnel, trapping the men inside. Emily choked on the dust, stumbling forward. Jack pulled her up. "Keep going." They ran. And then, a light. Faint, small, but real. Jack pushed forward, pulling Emily with him. The tunnel opened up into the night air. They had made it out. Emily gasped, gulping in fresh air. The lynx shook dust from its fur, blinking at the sudden brightness. Jack exhaled sharply. Jesus. Behind them, the mine was sealed. The men were gone. Emily's legs gave out, and she collapsed onto the dirt. Jack knelt beside her. She looked up at him, her voice weak. "Are we safe?" Jack hesitated. Then he nodded. "Yeah, kid." He ruffled her hair. "We're safe." Emily believed him. For the first time in days, she finally believed it. She turned to the lynx, running her fingers through its fur. The animal nuzzled her. Jack stood, looking toward the horizon. "We gotta keep moving," he murmured. Emily smiled slightly. For the first time, she didn't feel lost. She felt like she was going home. And that was enough. Leave your like, subscribe to the channel, turn on the notification bell, and if you watched until now, comment, "I watched until here," and share your opinion about this story. Oh, and don't forget to watch the next video on the end screen. It's really exciting.